It's the dead of night. The door creaks open to the slave quarters. A white man steps through, his beady eyes greedily staring at his next target. The young woman is helpless to his control, his desire. He will get his way with her, just as he always has. The way it will continue to be, for as long as he owns her as property, she will be forced to bear his children. Or will she? As the man approaches her, ready to lay himself on her, she picks up a rusty hoe laying next to her on the ground, and with all the might in her body, strikes her aggressor square on the side of the skull. In a flash, everything is over. The slave master's body lies lifeless on the ground, a sign of resistance against a system that had trampled over the lives of countless innocent black women. And today, that woman is free. For enslaved black women in the antebellum South, no place on the plantation offered sanctuary or freedom. Only a different backdrop for the sexual exploitation that defined the horrors of slave breeding. But out of these depths of hell rose a powerful resistance. Today we're going to be uncovering the wicked ways in which plantation owners would abuse and exploit their female slaves, along with the heroic and often untold story of their attempts to fight back, using their intellect, their bodies, and their unbreakable spirit to challenge the masters who sought to control their very lives. On southern plantations, enslaved women faced a nightmare that rarely makes it into history books. Across the South, masters forced themselves on enslaved women as a matter of routine. These violations served multiple purposes: asserting dominance, increasing the slave population, and breaking spirits. Oftentimes, the offspring of these unions faced fates crueler than death, being sold away from their mothers when they were of age. If the offspring was a woman and had light enough skin, she would be considered a fancy girl and become destined for a life where she would face the same violation her mother endured. In this world of absolute control and silence, one woman found the courage to speak. Harriet Jacobs, born into slavery in 1813, lived under the constant threat of violation from her master, Dr. James Norcom. From the age of 15, Jacobs suffered his unwanted advances and obsessive control. She couldn't turn to anyone for help, not even white women who claimed to oppose slavery, but turned a blind eye to the violation and abuse happening from the white men on plantations. When Harriet Jacobs finally did escape north to tell the horrors of her captivity, many abolitionists hesitated to publish Jacobs' full account. Her story contained truths many Americans couldn't stomach: that respected Southern gentlemen routinely violated enslaved women, that white women often knew and looked away, that children were born from these acts and then sold as property. These weren't the sanitized stories of slavery many Northern whites preferred to hear. But Jacobs understood her audience. When she finally wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861, she addressed it primarily to Northern white women. She knew exactly how to frame her experience to make them listen. She appealed to their sense of Christian morality and their identities as mothers and wives. "You never knew what it is to be a slave," she wrote, "to be entirely unprotected by law or custom." Her writing tore away at the lie of peaceful Southern plantation life. Harriet Jacobs offered a first-hand testimony from a black woman speaking directly about abuse and exploitation. She challenged the myth of the kindly master, the happy slave, and the civilized South that Southern politicians loved to yap about. And of course, many whites tried to discredit her. They claimed, because she was a black woman, she couldn't possibly have written such an articulate book. Others said she exaggerated or invented her experiences. Some simply refused to believe that respectable white men could behave as she described. But Harriet Jacobs didn't write to just gain sympathy. She wrote as an act of war against the institution of slavery, her pen becoming a weapon in a culture that denied black women any other means of fighting back. But while Jacobs eventually gained her freedom through writing, not all enslaved women could write their way to freedom. Harriet Jacobs didn't write her story for sympathy. She wrote it as resistance, and her courage paved the way for us to tell these truths today. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, stories that challenge the whitewashed version of history. Make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. We're not just here to educate, we're here to remember, to honor, and to fight back against the erasure of Black resistance. Let's look at Margaret Garner, a Black woman whose actions show how far a mother would go to defy what slave masters wanted and to protect her children from a life of pain. Despite being enslaved, Margaret had a husband and children, trying to make the best out of her situation. In January 1856, Margaret and her family decided to escape. They wanted to reach a place where they could be free, away from the constant fear that defined their lives. But slave catchers were always on the hunt, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made things even more dangerous. This law meant that even if enslaved people escaped up north where slavery was illegal, they could still be captured and dragged back to the South. Most who attempted escape would be faced with execution or put in worse conditions than before. For Margaret, the thought of being returned to slavery was a terror beyond words. Even more terrifying was the thought of her children facing that same life, knowing what could that they too could be sexually exploited and abused at the hands of white plantation owners. And unfortunately, Margaret and her family were found on their way to escape the South. Slave catchers cornered them in a small cabin where they had taken shelter. Margaret knew what being caught meant. She knew the beatings that would follow. She knew her children would grow up owned by others, their bodies abused by others. In that moment of pure desperation, with the captors breaking down the door, Margaret Garner made an unthinkable choice. She grabbed a knife, tragically ending the life of her own 2-year-old daughter, Mary. Can you imagine that? How horrible the conditions had to be for the enslaved to have Margaret make such a horrific decision. No white Northerner could ever understand the pain and suffering Margaret and other female slaves underwent on a regular basis. There was no way any of them could understand a life of constant torment and suffering. For a long time, history books and old news stories focused on the shock of what Margaret did. They painted her as a monster, a madwoman. It was easier for people to see her as a crazy monster than to look at the terrible system of slavery that pushed her to such a desperate act. It allowed people to condemn her actions without condemning the institution that caused them. It would take more than 100 years for people to begin to properly understand the tragedy of Margaret Garner's story. But why was such a powerful story of defiance hidden for so long? It's simple, really. It didn't fit the national narrative for the longest time. How could you justify Jim Crow laws and the states' rights of the lost cause narrative while also acknowledging the horrors that women like Margaret went through? You couldn't. Especially when historical accounts were often written by men who intentionally overlooked many of the ways minority women retaliated against the system. When we talk about resistance during slavery, what pictures come to mind? Nat Turner's rebellion? The stories that fill our history books almost always center on men who took up arms against their oppressors. But where are the women in these stories of resistance? History has painted enslaved women as passive victims, overlooking their critical role in fighting against the system that oppressed them. The truth is, Black women's resistance has been intentionally erased from our historical record. Historian Rebecca Hall spent years digging through dusty archives searching for traces of Black women who fought back. What she found was shocking. Not just the stories themselves, but how deliberately they had been buried or distorted in official records. Hall discovered that ships carrying enslaved Black women had more revolts than those without women. Yet when she searched through court records and historical documents, women were rarely mentioned as leaders or participants. When they were mentioned, their actions were downplayed or dismissed. Why? Because acknowledging Black women as strategic fighters disrupted the entire narrative that justified slavery and continues to justify oppression today. The resistance of enslaved women didn't always look like armed rebellion. Sometimes it was subtle, hidden in plain sight. Consider the plantation mistress who suddenly fell ill after meals prepared by an enslaved cook, or the mysterious fires that destroyed cotton storehouses after an enslaved woman had been brutally beat. These were all calculated acts of defiance. Some enslaved women would intentionally break tools or misunderstand instructions to sabotage plantation production. Others use their knowledge of herbs and roots as a form of resistance. A well-placed handful of herbs in the master's soup could cause illness, weakness, or even death. Sometimes they would even grind up bits of glass and sprinkle them in the food of their master. Now that doesn't normally get covered in our history books, does it? But what about when enslaved women wanted to get a little more direct? How did enslaved women organize these acts of resistance under the watchful eyes of their masters? Many created secret networks, often through their domestic work that gave them access to different parts of the plantation. Laundresses who traveled between houses spread news and coordinated resistance plans. Women gathering in kitchens, at wells, or in fields whispered strategies of escape beneath the songs they sang. These networks of resistance also extended beyond individual plantations, as enslaved women who traveled to sell goods became crucial messengers between different enslaved communities. They shared information about escape routes, sympathetic whites, and planned rebellions. These networks operated right under the noses of enslavers who believed black women were too dumb to fight back. Perhaps the most personal form of resistance was the fight against forced breeding. Plantation owners valued enslaved women, not just for their labor, but for their ability to produce more enslaved people. Each new child born into slavery represented profit, about $300 to $500 in the 1800s. Enslaved women fought this horrific system through various means, including using cotton root and other plants known to prevent pregnancy or cause miscarriages. Some women faked illness, making themselves appear undesirable to predatory masters. Others formed protective communities where they watched over each other and young girls approaching puberty. The endurance of these women, their refusal to be broken by a system that treated them as breeding stock, represents a form of resistance rarely acknowledged in our telling of history. So why has this history been suppressed? Because acknowledging black women as tactical fighters, as leaders of resistance, fundamentally challenges the narrative of passive victimhood that has dominated our understanding of slavery. It threatens the comfortable fiction that enslaved people accepted their condition. Most importantly, it reveals that black women have always been at the forefront of liberation struggles, even when history refuses to record their contributions. The erasure of these stories is a deliberate silencing that continues to shape how we view black women's resistance today. I think we all can at least try to understand that the fight for freedom has always had black women at its core, strategizing, organizing, and refusing to accept the world as it was. We've seen how enslaved black women fought back. Harriet Jacobs with her powerful words, Margaret Garner with her desperate final act to protect her child, and countless unnamed women who poisoned masters, burned buildings, and created underground networks of resistance. But the strategies these women used still live on in modern black women's activism. The way Harriet Jacobs carefully crafted her narrative to reach white women readers? You see that same tactical brilliance when black women today use social media to spread their stories, knowing exactly how to frame issues to reach different audiences. The secret networks enslaved women built to protect each other? Those same community care networks exist today, with black women creating mutual aid groups and community defense systems. Historian Nikki M. Taylor writes about enslaved women who murdered their white owners, using a black feminist framework to unravel the details of these rebellious women's lives and unpack the levels of institutional violence they faced. Look at the struggle for reproductive rights today. Black women fighting for control over their own bodies isn't a new battle. It's directly connected to how enslaved women fought against slave-breeding masters who saw their wombs as property. When enslaved women used cotton root to prevent pregnancy, they were claiming ownership of their bodies in a system that denied them that right. Today's fight against restrictive abortion laws, forced sterilization, and maternal health disparities comes from that same determination to control their own bodies. The American judicial system was never designed for black women to receive justice. From the beginning, courts protected the interests of slave owners and white society. Today, we still see unequal sentencing for black and white defendants who commit the same crime. These aren't new problems. They're the same system working exactly as it was designed to work. If you want to learn more about a freedom fight of Black resistance, check out our video on Nat Turner and his rebellion that almost destroyed America. This was Black Stories Untold. And as always, thanks for watching.